Good morning. I'm Monica Harrison, the Executive Director of the Nevada State Board of Architecture, Interior Design and Residential Design. I would like to welcome everyone to this year's virtual continuing education seminar. This is our 8th annual continuing education seminar, and unfortunately, due to the pandemic restrictions and for your safety, this year's seminar is being held virtually. And just before we get started, I would like to express my gratitude to Randy Levine, Executive Director of AIA Nevada, Kelly Levine, Operations Manager of AIA Nevada, and our Public Information Officer, Stacy Hatfield, for all their help making this event come together smoothly and for putting together such a great program with 4 sessions today that I'm sure everyone will enjoy. And really quick, please don't forget to renew your license after you've earned all your 8 CEUs. And as a reminder, you can do it online, or if you prefer to send us the paper renewal form, you can send it by mail as well. Now, I would like to turn it over to Randy Levine, Executive Director of AIA Nevada. Randy, you have the virtual floor.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. And I also want to welcome you to the 2020 AIA NSB AIDRD CE seminar. That's a mouthful. But we're so glad that you are all here. AIA is, of course, proud to be a sponsor with the State Board in order to provide these continuing education opportunities. We wish we could be meeting in person, but since we can't, we'll make the best of this situation. I want to introduce and thank our sponsors for this event. Without our sponsors, we could not provide these programs, so we're sincerely grateful for their support. Kathy Wilson, who is the founder and owner of Nevada Sales Agency, could not be with us today. So I just want to say a few words on her behalf. Nevada Sales Agency represents a number of excellent lighting and site amenities manufacturers and works in partnership with you, their clients, to find the best solutions to your lighting and space amenities needs. Since 1980, Nevada Sales Agency has helped the Las Vegas community to find controls, site amenities, and lighting solutions. And in doing so, they have built strong relationships with business partners that include architects, designers, manufacturers, and many more across the community. The staff is committed to connecting people to develop and design beautiful, well-lit spaces. And you can certainly contact Kathy Wilson or any of the excellent staff members at nevadasalesagency.com. And now I'd like to introduce our exceptional sponsor for today's seminar, Brady Bryan, Principal of Brain Consulting, LLC. Brady, would you like to say a few words to everyone?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Randy. It's a pleasure to be a sponsor here today. A little bit about myself and Brain. I'm the CEO and principal and partner at Brain. We are a specialty tax incentive consulting company that assists architecture and engineering firms with specialty tax incentives. Chief of which is the R&D tax credit. There's also the 179D deduction that we help with, particularly with architects and engineers that are designing government-owned buildings. And then finally, especially for the residential architects today, we also help with the 45L tax credit, which is a $2,000 per unit tax credit for multi and single family developments once they're placed into service. And that would actually go to the developer owner of those properties. And so I figured it would be fitting to also mention that, given the number of residential architects here today. Thank you so much, everyone. Also in the chat over here, I put my LinkedIn connection, so would absolutely be thrilled to connect with you all. So please feel free to reach out and connect with me. Oh, and one thing I forgot to mention, Randy, is I'm actually based here in the Las Vegas area. I'm in Henderson. newly relocated from California. Please don't hold that against me. So really, really happy to be here with my wife and family, three children and 3 French bulldogs.
Oh, all right. Well, welcome to the community, Brady. We're happy to have you here.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
So I'm assuming you are all set for a great day of CE sessions. Monica, Stacy Hatfield, Kelly Levine, and I will be with you all day. Use the Q&A box if you have any questions. And I just want to do a quick run through of the agenda so everybody's kind of on the same page here. We will begin shortly with our first session, scoping for accessibility in new and existing buildings. And then following that session, we will take a 15-minute break at 10 o'clock. And then we will break again for lunch after the second session at 12:15. We will take an hour for lunch, and then we will come back at 1:15 for our third session of the day, which lasts until 3:15. So these are 2-hour sessions each time. The fourth session will begin at 3:30, and we should be completed by 5:30 this afternoon, with all of you getting all those beautiful CE credits. So you can renew your license and in the various states. So now I'd like to introduce Stacy Hatfield. She is the Public Information Officer for the Nevada State Board of Architecture, Interior Design, and Residential Design. Stacy?
Thanks, Randy. So we have a full day ahead of us. I'm just going to go over some instructions very quickly so we can get our day started. Only the presenters and AIA and board staff will be visible on your screen. All attendees will be muted and your cameras will be off. So to ask questions, please use the Q&A option on the lower navigation bar at the bottom of your screen. You just click on that Q&A option and type your question in, and the speakers will be able to answer your questions at the end of their presentation. We ask that you try not to log off during the day, during the breaks, during lunch. Remember, your cameras will be off and you'll be muted. If you do have to log off, you will need to log back on through the link that you logged on with this morning. If you remember from past seminars, we always had a paper evaluation form for you to fill out at the end of the day. This year, no paper forms, but we will send you an email with a link to a virtual survey at the end of the day. It will be from SurveyMonkey. We ask that you take a minute and fill it out. It's just a few questions. It really helps us plan for the next year. And lastly, you will receive your certificate of completion via email within about 1 week following the seminar. So with those reminders out of the way, we will get to our first session this morning, which is Scoping for Accessibility in New and Existing Buildings. It's presented by Todd Snyder, PE, SE, CBO from West Coast Code Consultants. Mr. Snyder is a licensed structural engineer in multiple states, an ICC certified building official, and a certified building, mechanical, energy, and accessibility plans examiner. He received his master's degree from the University of Utah in civil and environmental engineering and has years of experience in the structural design of a variety of building types. He currently serves as West Coast Code Consultants Utah Regional Manager and leads his team with a strong focus on quality and service to jurisdictional clients. His expertise is frequently sought out as an approved ICC instructor, and Todd is regularly invited to teach code classes to building official, design professional, and contractor organizations throughout the United States. He is fascinated by code and its various aspects and enjoys sharing his knowledge with others as they seek to establish safe and healthy communities for their citizens. Todd, as Monica said, the virtual floor is yours.
All right, thank you guys for coming out today and for inviting me to present. Let me see if I can get the right screen shared with you. So here we go. And see if you guys can see the presentation at least. Is that showing up on everyone's screen?
Yes.
All right. And then I will just get started. As they said, I work for West Coast Code Consultants. We're a third-party plan review agency. We do various projects. Over the last 6 years, I've worked on everything from the Apple campus to dinosaurs, just about any sort of structure you might see. And so today's class, we're going to focus on just an introduction into the scoping requirements of of the building code for accessibility. And so, oh, let me click on the right screen. Here we go. Maybe. Okay, that'll work. So today, what we're going to talk about is we're going to learn about when alterations to existing buildings will trigger an accessibility upgrade. We're going to talk about understanding the scope of accessibility requirements in those existing buildings. We're going to talk about accessibility requirements as well in new construction. And finally, we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between the ADA guidelines, FHA requirements, and ICC A117, as well as what's required in the building code. You'll notice down at the bottom of my screen, it has absolutely nothing to do with the rest of the presentations, but I like to watch movies. So there are random movie quotes at the bottom of most screens. They don't have, most of the time they have absolutely nothing to do with the slides, but if you get bored, because talking about building codes all day is the most exciting day you guys are going to have, right? So if you get bored, just read the quote at the bottom of the screen and chuckle if you get the reference. If not, I just do want to warn you, if you get all the references, that means you're pretty much as nerdy as I am, so be careful there. All right, jumping right into it, we're going to look at these 3 different books today. We're actually not going to jump too far into this book, the ICC A117. We don't have enough time to jump into it. This is the reference standard, and I'll talk about it a little bit in a second. But we're predominantly going to talk about building code requirements for accessibility, which are going to be found in the IBC and for existing buildings under the IEBC in the 2018 IBC codes that are adopted currently in the state and most jurisdictions in the state of Nevada. Looking at this, we're going to talk about accessibility. I want to highlight here, and we're going to jump right into where ADA and accessibility comes from. So this is a standard that's put together. It still is noted by ANSI and American National Standard Institute, but it is now officially under the title ICC A117.1. It's the latest version is now the 2017 version, but that is not being referenced until the 2021 building code. So the currently referenced standard in the 18 code is this one, the 2009 ICC A117. Now, this is a standard that was put together by a panel of committees for persons with hearing impairment, the deaf and blind community, as well as those in wheelchairs, little people, and other groups of disabled people have come together, or persons with disabilities, to establish this with code officials to create a building code standard. This standard was mirrored in 1990, I'm going to get the date wrong because I don't have it on my slide today, in the mid-90s with the ADA guidelines. And so what you're going to find is the ADA guidelines is federal regulation, and all architects, builders, owners, and everything are regulated and governed by the ADA standards. But building codes only come into play under the provisions of the IBC. And so your building officials will only be approving things or reviewing things according to the building code, but owners, architects, designers will be responsible for maintaining ADA guidelines. In addition to ADA guidelines apply only to public buildings. And so when it comes to single family dwellings and residences, while there are provisions in ICC A117 as well as the building code for those, they are not ADA standards. Those will fall under the FHA guidelines. And so FHA guidelines find the 2012 IBC and ICC A117 2009 as what they call a safe harbor, meaning that if you meet these requirements, you also meet FHA requirements. But just again, a warning to remember that while the building code enforces these standards, we only enforce those that are applicable to the jurisdiction requirements. And so the jurisdiction doesn't necessarily apply to all portions of the building. So there may be ADA requirements, such as doorbells in public places and other locations other things like that that are requirements of ADAG, but are not enforced by the building official or referenced in ICC A117. So just be aware that there are federal standards. The intent of this standard is to cover both the requirements of FHA and ADA, but only in as far as the jurisdiction and scoping of the building code goes. And so there are provisions in here that are not in ADA. There are also provisions in ADA that do not get touched by this and are not referenced by the building official. Let's see, there we go. So looking at that again, just clarifying, we're going to talk about the building code in general today. I'm not going to go into the standard too much, but just so you're aware, the building code is what is typically adopted by a jurisdiction and enforced by the building official. The reference standard ICCA 117 is referenced by the building code. The building code indicates clearly in section 102 that only the portions of the standard referenced in the code apply. And so as such, what we're going to find out is there are several provisions in ICCA 117 that actually don't come into play in the building code. So when you're designing a building, there's information, for example, about stairs, type C units, ATMs, etc., that you'll find inside ICCA 117, but you will not find inside the building, but you'll find in ICCA 117, but you will not find in the building code. They are not applicable to the building code requirements. They're there in the standard because this is a standard that can be used by multiple people. Type C units, for example, is for retirement communities that some owners may want to enforce those provisions as a national standard, but they are not necessarily adopted by the building code or not necessarily enforced. And so what we're going to focus on today is predominantly the provisions of IBC and IEBC and indicate which items of accessibility provisions are required by the building code. Now, one of the reasons I think this class is so popular is because everyone fears the ADA lawsuits. There have been so many ADA lawsuits in California that the CCDA has come out and established a listing of all lawsuits. Now, this is kind of an older one I've referenced here. I haven't gone and updated it recently. And so this looks at the top 10 demand letters and claims in 2017 and 2018. So what this says is it looks at all the lawsuits that have been filed, whether or not the plaintiff won or not, or what the charges or what the cost of the lawsuits were. They just specify the number of lawsuits that have been filed and what they were regarding. And the intent of this, and you can go to this website right here, the www.dgscca.gov, and find this information for current states. The intent is to notify owners, architects, designers, what things are the lawsuits are coming from so that you can avoid those lawsuits. And one of the interesting things as we look at this, and these lawsuits are predominantly going to be obviously for existing buildings, the number one lawsuit is regarding parking, is that the spaces and stripes are not accessible, do not meet the requirements of the code. That accounts to 13% of all lawsuits filed. The next one is that the entry, there's a non-compliant curb or entry in from the parking lot to the building. 10% of all lawsuits are that one. That there are insufficient ADA parking stalls accounts for another 10% of all lawsuits. That there are not adequate loading zones or van accessible stalls accounts for an additional 7%. Interior tables, counters, or bars are too high is 6% of the lawsuits. The accessible entrance to the building is not on an accessible route from the public way. It accounts for 6.7% of the lawsuits. Inadequate signage for parking or parking stalls notifying which ones are accessible is another 5.3%. General violations, interior features not meeting requirements account for about 4% of lawsuits. And the route does not having incorrect door hardware or thresholds accounts for 4%. And finally, service equipment, pools account for 2.2%, rounding up the lost top 10. Now, some of the information I want to point out is this is not all lawsuits, obviously. This accounts for, but it does account for these top 10 items account for 70% of all lawsuits which were filed in the years 2017 and 2018. And so you're going to see that the majority of lawsuits that will occur are going to be one of these top 10 demand items. Now, the next one that's kind of frightening is that over 50% are related to the site, not the building itself. And the reason I say that's frightening is because, quite simply, whenever I do a TI review, I often ask, I need a site plan. I need to know what's going on with the exterior of the building. How do you get into this building? And the response is, well, that's outside the scope of my review. Well, this leads to the question, is it outside the scope of my review? If you're not updating the site as part of the interior remodel, you're leaving yourself and the owner open to over 50% of all lawsuits. The reason being is it doesn't matter how nice and accessible your toilet room is if you can't even get into the building in the first place. And so predominantly, these are where the majority of lawsuits are going to occur. We need to be very cautious about making sure that the site plan is up to date and meets code. And we'll talk about when that is not required as we look into the IEBC. Now, the IEBC came in the 2015 code and the 2018 code. There's been some additional changes and reorganizations. And so what we'll notice here is that in the IEBC, there are 3 different methods in which an architect or designer can choose from in addressing these items. Prescriptive methods, there is a question about who is filing all these lawsuits, and this is just a note of all lawsuits which have been filed in the state of California in those 2 years. It's anybody who filed a lawsuit at all. So it doesn't give me an exact number of how many lawsuits were filed. It's just a percentage of the total number of ADA lawsuits which were filed, which accounted for those accounts. I hope that helps address that question. So there are 3 different methods. We have the prescriptive method for dealing with existing buildings, work area method, and the performance method. Under the 2015 code, there were separate accessibility provisions for each of those, depending on which method you used. As of the 2018 code with the reorganization, now accessibility requirements are found in section 305, and these accessibility requirements are the same regardless of what method you use. So if you've got an existing building, you'll go to EBC 305, and this gives you the scoping requirements for what accessibility provisions you have to meet, depending on, regardless of whether or not you're doing an addition, an alteration, change of occupancy, and what method, prescriptive, work area, or performance that you're going to use for the rest of the design. Everything's going to come out of that section of code. So looking in IEBC, the first one we're looking at is a partial change of occupancy. If you've got a building, you're modifying a partial change of occupancy. The most common one I see here is I'm going to change a portion of a warehouse into an office space. That's a change from an S occupancy into a B occupancy. That would be the exact same as if it was an alteration. So the portion of the building that's changing occupancy counts as an alteration, an altered space. If you provide a complete change of occupancy, meaning the entire building is going to change. This is maybe I'm taking an old grocery store and converting it into a gym, or I'm taking an existing office building and I'm going to turn it into a hospital or a doctor's facility. So anytime I make a modification from one occupancy into another and I change the entire building, this comes into play. I still have to have all new and altered elements have to be accessible, but in addition, now I must also provide at least one accessible entrance to the building. I must provide an accessible route to the primary function of the building, and we'll talk more about primary function in a bit. I have to provide adequate accessibility signage for restrooms, accessible doors, entrances, and so forth. I must provide accessible parking where parking is provided. Now, this is not saying where accessible parking is provided, it must be compliant. It says where parking is provided for that facility, accessible parking must now be provided in that for that facility. If a loading zone is provided for that building, or a drop-off zone, like a porta cochere at a hotel or at a hospital entrance or so forth. We'll talk more about that when we get to scoping on the IBC. It also has to be made accessible. And so these items that may be existing elements now have to be upgraded to meet the plan. Notice that we are going to upgrade several site features, accessible parking and loading zones, as well as an accessible route and entrance into the building, all based on interior remodeling only. So the scope is now going to be expanded to include site work because they have a complete change of occupancy of the interior of the structure. Looking at change of occupancy, there are some exceptions. The first one is type B units. This is an individual dwelling unit, which is being shown here, that if there are no accessible routes, upgrades required to that unit. So you don't have to change a building. There are several old apartment buildings that have been built that have split entrances or stairs leading down, stairs leading up. There's no accessible route into them. As we modify these existing buildings under FHA guidelines, there's no requirement to bring these old outdated type B units into compliance. So there's no accessible route upgrades. However, you would still need to make at least one level accessible and may need to upgrade some of the type B units inside the building, but no accessible route to those units. The other one is technically infeasible, where it becomes technically infeasible to meet the current requirements of the code. You can You're only required to move it forward to the extent feasible. Now, looking at technically infeasible, the problem I run into is it's often misinterpreted. And what technically infeasible says in the building code is that full compliance would require alteration of a structural load-bearing member or is not possible due to site constraints, typically meaning property lines or other things where you don't have the ability to adjust items. I want to clarify that because it is not meaning that it's too expensive, it's not part of the scope of work, or it's inconvenient. I've had a lot of people say, well, remodeling the bathroom is going to cost more than my entire remodel. Well, that's great. It's expensive, but unless you have to move a bearing wall to update the bathroom, it's not technically infeasible. It's only technically infeasible if you had to move a bearing wall or if there physically isn't space inside the building without moving a part of the building to do so. The other one is technical infeasibility only applies when specifically referenced as an exception. So for the additional requirements in the IEBC for a for change in occupancy, for example, it references technically infeasibility, and you can get out of those requirements slightly as far as you can because it's technically infeasible. Again, remember, just because it's technically infeasible doesn't mean you're exempt entirely. You still have to bring things up to speed, up to code, as much as technically feasible. And so a stair may not have the proper width to count as an accessible means of egress, but you might still end up having to provide an area of refuge at the top and bottom, two-way communication devices, and so forth. You may not be able to install an elevator, but you would still have to then install grab bars and so forth in the bathroom. So again, we're going to look and see what scope there is. So if there is anything that you aren't going to be able to meet the requirements due to technical infeasibility, you just need to specify what the infeasibility is, what structural load-bearing members or alterations cannot be done due to site constraints, and then what methods or what extent it can be completed, what is feasible as part of that construction. And please realize that there are some upgrades that may be required even if they're technically infeasible. So even though you will require modifications to the structure, there are certain times in which the code will mandate them. Again, it only can be, you can only use technical infeasibility to get out of a provision if the references directly say so. So there needs to be an exception in the section you're looking at. All right, there's a pretty interesting addition to an existing building, right? That is that I don't think they actually built that. That's just a sketched image on a website. But when we do add in additions and we're looking at things, the way the code addresses that all new elements, everything inside that funky looking building next being added on, has to be fully accessible. And if I alter a primary function or the addition includes an area of primary function, I'm going to have to meet the primary function requirements, which we'll talk about shortly. If I'm altering an existing building, and here's a remodel going on inside this building, every portion of the alteration, everything inside the altered scope has to be brought into compliance with ADA, with ICCA 117. The exception is if it's not located on an accessible route, I don't have, and I should clarify that, it's not that an accessible route doesn't exist, because there's several existing buildings that don't have an existing accessible route. But if an accessible route is not required to that space, and so if you're in a location of a building that does not require an accessible route, you don't have to bring that section of the building up to code. You do not, for alterations, have to provide an accessible means of egress. Now, this is a change in the 2018 codes, whereas before, all additions, alterations, modifications, you never had to provide an accessible means of egress. Additions do have to have an accessible means of egress. You do not have to do it, though, for alterations. Privately owned type A units. So if I'm in a type A unit, and type A units is unique to the building code, and we're not going to go into those today very much, but if I'm in a type A unit and I own it myself and I do a remodel, I only have to bring it up to type B. Type A means I can convert it into a fully accessible dwelling unit. Well, if I'm not disabled and I don't have a disability, I'm not required to make my unit that I'm living in and own a type A. And so even though it was a type A when I bought it, if I modify it, I only have to meet the type B requirements if I'm the owner builder. And then if I'm making modifications to an apartment complex or other dwelling unit, facility with dwelling units, I don't have to bring type B units into effect. I don't have to upgrade the units until I modify at least 50% of the units. So looking at this, the next one up in here is entrances to buildings. So we're going to look at scoping. So when I'm doing an alteration, there are some provisions in here for what the limitations of the scoping is going to be. So if I'm modifying an entrance to the building code would normally say, well, if you're modifying, you have to make it accessible. Except if I'm modifying a secondary entrance to a building, then I don't, and there's already an existing accessible entrance, then I don't have to make one accessible. So here we look at this main door to the Sweet Tooth Fairy right here, and there's this accessible route leading into the building and up this door. If they were to come in and do an addition and add this Cosmo-proof building into the Sweet Tooth Fairy, or add it on, or we can see they've added on over here, there's already another door over here. They may modify or change this door as part of the alteration and changing this portion into adding it onto the Sweet Tooth Fairy. But as they already have an existing accessible entrance, there's no requirement to make any alterations to the door that they're adding. So this door that's being modified does not have to be upgraded. So altered entrances are not required to be accessible as long as there's an existing entrance that's accessible, though directional signage would be required. And so if this door over here was not on an accessible route, they would in fact need to come in and provide a sign here at the right of way indicating that the accessible entrance is located over there. Elevators, when you're modifying an elevator inside of a building, only the portions that are being altered have to be made accessible. So if you're altering the call signals in the hallway, the call signals in the hallway would have to be brought up to code, but you would not have to change the size or modification or anything else inside the building. Platform lifts inside alterations, the modification inside existing buildings is that a platform lift can always be used as part of the accessible route. In new construction, we'll talk about a little later, it's very limited when you can and can't use a platform lift, but in existing buildings, a platform lift is always permitted to meet the intent of an accessible route. If I install a new set of stairs or an escalator in the building, I always have to include an accessible route. So I have to install an elevator. And the idea is, and the exception is, if there were no major structural modifications. The idea is if I'm cutting a hole in the floor and moving bearing walls, adding beams and posts to install a stair that is not accessible, then I can cut a hole in the floor and add beams and columns, etc., to install an elevator or a lift to make that route accessible as well. When I'm modifying existing ramps, and this is particularly true of curb ramps, I'm allowed slightly steeper slopes. For ramps up to 3 inches, I can go 110, and for ramps up to 6 inches in height, I can go steeper than 112. I can't, but not more than 110. When modifying dwelling units, only new or altered dwelling units count as the number and determine the type of the number. And so I may have a large existing facility, I'm adding on a new dwelling unit or a group of dwelling units. Only the new dwelling units count when I'm adding up to determine the number of accessible or type B or type A units that I'm supposed to install. I ignore all those that are already on the site and existing. Jury boxes, they need to have a wheelchair space. The wheelchair space is not required if it's an existing facility. Toilet rooms, there's a nice little accessible toilet room, right? That's even going to be hard for able-bodied people to reach the toilet paper dispenser on the wrong wall there. Toilet rooms, you can get out of a toilet room modifications where it is technically infeasible. And what the code will say is that if it's technically infeasible to update the toilet room, you can install a single unisex toilet room instead of updating the bathroom. You can still count all the fixtures inside the non-accessible existing toilet room, and except for you would have to provide a new unisex restroom on the same floor level. There was a question about the platform lifts in a tenant improvement. Yes, inside of tenant improvement, a platform lift counts as an accessible route. Dressing rooms, if I'm making modifications to a building, it includes dressing rooms where it's technically infeasible to update the existing dressing rooms, I can add one per gender that is accessible, but it must be located on the same level and in the same vicinity. Fuel dispensers do not have to be made accessible, existing fuel dispensers. Thresholds, we're going to allow a slightly higher threshold in existing buildings, and existing amusement rides being modified do not have to be brought up to code. It'd be really hard to come in and say, oh, we're remodeling the Matterhorn at Disneyland. Now you have to make a wheelchair space inside this ride, and have to completely change the design of that existing facility or ride. And so existing rides do not have to be made accessible. The ride itself does not have to be altered in order to bring it into compliance. Primary function. Primary function is the major activity for which a space is intended. And this is where things often get confused, because the code says that if I alter an area, and it includes an area with the primary function. And so a lot of people confuse primary function with change of occupancy. The primary function is what it's mainly used for. So in this picture, the primary function is an office space, the customer lobby in a bank, dining areas in a cafeteria, meeting rooms in conference centers. Those are all prime examples, and offices, as I have in the picture, in a business center. These are all examples of areas which contain a primary function. And so if your alteration happens in an area that contains a primary function, it doesn't matter if you're changing it, because it's not, that would make it a change of use when we go to the change of use section. But if you're altering an area that has the primary function, and so for example, in this picture here, if I were to change these open cubicle, this open office area, and remove these cubicles and install some built-in office areas, I would be making an alteration in an area containing the primary function, because this is an office and I'm altering an office space. And so now I would fall into compliance. While it was an office before and it's an office still, I now have to meet the primary function requirements. Some exceptions are if I'm modifying closets, bathrooms, stairs. These are areas that are not part of the primary function of a space. And so alterations of those will not trigger an alteration inside an area containing a primary function. So if my addition or alteration contains an area which is the primary function of that building, even if it's going to remain the same as what it was before, I do have to meet some specific requirements. And this is, again, going to be the same whether or not you use the prescriptive or performance method, whether or not it's a tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3 alteration, you're still going to have to meet these requirements. So one of the examples I had is I had a convenience store, and inside this convenience store, they came in and they said, oh, we want to change the sales counter, we want to change all the cashier's desk, we want to change the shelving for shopping. Well, that is the primary function of a convenience store. And so even though all they were doing was replacing the shelving, it now triggers all of the following requirements. First of all, I have to have an accessible route to the primary function, and this is from the public way. So once again, I am now going to be stepping outside of the building to update a route from the site into the building. So now they had to put in curb cuts and everything else because they were altering the sales floor of a convenience store. Parking. If there's parking provided, they now have to update the accessible route from the accessible parking to the building entrance. If there's no accessible parking, they need to provide accessible parking to give them a route to the entrance of the building. They need to provide an accessible entrance into the building, and they have to provide an interior route from the accessible entrance to the altered location. And so if you're on the second floor of a building, this is interior routes, what's going to trigger you to have to install an elevator. If the building requires an elevator or requires an accessible interior route, you'll need to install it. So an alteration on the second floor will require an elevator or a lift to get you up to that second floor level if needed. In addition to that, toilet facilities, accessible toilet facilities must be provided. Now, to determine the number of toilet facilities that have to be accessible, this doesn't mean all the toilet facilities on site, but the toilet facilities required for the space being altered. And so if I'm altering a conference room with 300 people in it, I would then find out how many toilet rooms are required, how many toilet facilities are required, men's and women's, for that 300 occupant space that's being altered. And I must then provide accessible toilet facilities somewhere inside the building for those 300 occupants and an accessible route from the space being altered to those toilet facilities. Drinking fountains. I also have to provide drinking fountains for those people that are in the altered space. Again, the thought process here is that if a squirrel can use it, it's an accessible drinking fountain, right? Now, there are some scope limitations because it wouldn't seem drastically fair if all I was doing was replacing some outlets and light switches in my office to have on the second story of a building to have to install an elevator, do some curb cuts and everything else. And so the code says, first of all, if all you're doing is hardware modifications, windows, outlets, signages, etc., none of that's going to be, even though it's in an area of the primary function, it doesn't really count as an alteration and will not trigger an updated accessible route. If I'm just replacing electrical equipment or HVAC equipment, I don't have to modify the accessible route, add bathrooms, etc. to that space. If I'm doing a fire protection sprinkler, fire alarm system, abatement of hazardous materials, again, none of those items will trigger this. And finally, if all I'm doing is alterations to improve the accessibility. So for example, I had a church and they wanted to add an accessible ramp inside the building to lead up to the rostrum so that people could get up onto the stand and speak. And so they were adding this accessible route. Now that's obviously inside the worship room, the chapel, that is the area of the primary function. And so it would typically trigger an accessible route. They have all the seating in there that would need to have accessible seating to be provided and so forth. But instead, the code says, no, no, no. All they're doing is adding an accessible ramp. And so the scoping limited them just those accessibility upgrades. Now, if they added other things, if they replaced the seating, if they modified something else inside the room, those would then trigger the accessible route upgrades. And then finally, in Type B sleeping units, any modification inside a Type B unit does not require me to update a route or anything else. So the first limitation, if you don't meet one of those exceptions, so I am making an alteration to a building, I'm going to modify, I'm going to add an office. Like right now in my office, we want to add a new door. We want to knock out a door so that I have direct access from my office out into the bullpen where everybody else is working. And so we're going to add a door there. Well, obviously it's not going to cost me much money. It's going to be a couple grand for us to install a glass door and a window. But if I was on the second floor of the building, I now have altered a primary function because obviously an office is the primary function of an office space. And so now I would have to install an elevator if we didn't have an elevator already in the building. Well, that seems ridiculous. A $2,000 remodel requires me to spend $50,000 to install an elevator in an existing building. And so the code says that you're not required to exceed 20% of the cost of the alteration to the primary function. And so what we're looking at is not anything that's going on. I'm going to look at my the primary function, the area that I'm altering inside the primary function. I'm going to take the cost it takes to modify that. And then the cost of upgrading bathrooms, the accessible route leading to that space, the site plan, any of those items that need to come into play, those ones do not need to exceed 20%. Now, I don't have to spend at least 20%, but they can exceed. I don't account for the cost of those in the case. So I don't go in and say, oh, I'm doing $2,000 to modify the door and another $20,000 to install the elevator now. And so is it more than 20%? No, it's 20% of the $2,000 remodel that I was planning on doing, which would lead me to say $400 is the maximum I have to spend on the expanded scope of the accessible route. I must provide the most possible within the 20% limit, but I don't have to spend the full 20%. And so if the elevator costs more than $20,000, more than the 20%, I don't have to spend that, but I have $400, I can't upgrade the bathrooms, but I could put signage on the front door indicating the location of the accessible route. I could put signage in the parking lot indicating proper signage for the ADA stall. And again, a lot of times the owner's like, why am I spending all this money? Well, again, remember, go back to that slide before and indicate where do all these lawsuits occur. Let's take this time to spend as much money doing what I can. I've got a good question here and I want to highlight this. So if a tenant improvement requires some major upgrades to the building or site, which is owned by the landlord, how have you seen that handled? Building code requirements cannot transcend property lines. So a lot of times I may have a parking lot that's owned by one person and a tenant building that's owned by someone else. While the tenant building, these primary function triggers would require them to upgrade the site, they don't own the site. And so the code will not require them then to upgrade the site because it's outside the scope. They can't physically do it. Same with ADA. ADA won't make them do that. Now, that being said, if it's a joint venture, where a lot of times it is, where the building owner and the tenant who's renting the space are going to pool their funds together and have a joint agreement as they upgrade the building, now that's going to change the scoping of it. And so the issue is you want, as an owner, an architect, designer, as a representative, you want to get some information from the owner indicating they're not going to do this. Now, second of all, the lawsuit still could happen. I upgrade my building, but there's no accessible parking space because the landlord didn't upgrade the accessible parking, the owner of that building could still get sued. And you as the architect or designer will want to let the owner know that. Now, they may be able to come in and prove that they couldn't upgrade the site and it needs to go to the landlord, and it probably will, but that doesn't stop them from being named in the lawsuit. And so they may want to, even though it's not legally obligated to upgrade, they might want to consider going to a different site that provides accessibility, or they may want to reach out to the landlord and say, hey, I'm coming into this space. You really need to upgrade the space and provide me with accessibility features such as an accessible route. I just worked on a Marriott hotel. I guess I probably shouldn't name that. So it was a hotel unnamed, and they hired us to do an accessibility provision of their building. But they were sitting on top of a concrete, 3-story concrete podium, which had multiple other facilities in it and everything else. And we pointed out to them that obviously our accessibility was going to be scope limited to their building, but they had parking spaces inside the parking stall that were allotted to their building that was owned by someone else. And when they found out that that was part of their accessible route, they called the landlord, and the next week I get a phone call from the landlord saying, hey, we want you to come out and do an accessibility review of our structure as well. And so you do want to make sure we're reaching that out to them as well. Does the architect determine which items will be upgraded within the 20% or the code enforcer? It is up to the design professional and the owner to set the limit of what you're upgrading. And so you can pick and choose your items. You can do all the cheap ones and not be able to afford the big ones. You can do one of the big ones and not any of the rest of them. The code enforcement agency might come in and tell you, hey, I need some better clarification as to what's going on, because you're saying you can't afford the elevator because it's $20,000, but of your $20,000, that's over $20,000, but of your $20,000 cost cap, you're putting in $500 worth of signage. That doesn't sound like you're really meeting the intent. So what else could you do? But it is ultimately the owner that's up there. In regards to drinking fountains, what are the ramifications of COVID for their long-term viability versus bottle filling stations? There's no changes in the code regarding bottle filling stations and drinking fountains. We may see a change, but the way the code works, well, it's not going to be until the 2024 code is the one that's currently being modified, and I don't think there were any amendments that were put forward to get rid of drinking fountains. So if you're worried about drinking fountains and replacing them with bottle filling stations, that's something that's going to have to come in on the code adoption process, where you're going to need to make current amendments to address those changes, because the building code has not addressed the fact that drinking fountains aren't being used. All right, jumping forward, if you are going to use the 20% cost cap, I would recommend that you document it, both as an owner and as the city, to look and make sure that you're specifying, in case there's a lawsuit in the future, that this doesn't happen. The other thing to recognize is this 20% cost cap, while the building official is going to look at it for that individual remodel, if there is a lawsuit, the way it comes down to is you walk into the courtroom and they say, it is 2020. ADA went into effect in 1990, I believe it's 5 or 6, somewhere in that range. You've had 24 years to come into compliance. You're telling me that in 24 years you've done nothing to this building, and so you don't have to meet these requirements. Because that 20% cost cap out of the ADA guidelines is over the life of the building. And so you may not meet the 20% cost cap for the first remodel, but if they do multiple small remodels over the next 10, 15 years, installing that elevator may end up being something that they should have or would have to do and could have been responsible for. So you want to maintain documentation, get the owner the documentation so they can show that, no, I haven't done enough work in this building to merit having installed an elevator or upgrading the site or whatever it might be that they're not doing because of the cost limitation. Now, the code doesn't give us any information, but there are a priority, yes. There is a priority, and that's the question being asked, and then we're noting here. That is, the priority is only in the CBC. It is not found in the building code at all, except in the IBC commentary. And this is the reference. They say you should start at the site entrance. Make sure you can get into the building first, and then provide an interior route from the accessible door to the space. then upgrade your restrooms, then upgrade your drinking fountains, then update your parking striping. So that's the order they recommend. Again, the priority is to get into the building first and then something else. Again, this is a suggestion. It isn't code outside of the CBC. What about historic buildings? How do we address historic buildings? Well, the building code says they're the exact same as any other alteration, with some minor exceptions. First of all, technically infeasible is all throughout. Anything inside a historic building that becomes technically infeasible, you now only have to do to the extent that is feasible. And if it threatens the historic value, if the installation of an elevator or a modification would threaten the historic value, you don't have to do it at all. Here are the allowed alternates in lieu of doing the modifications. If it threatens the historic value or if it's technically infeasible, this is what you do. You only need one site arrival point that's accessible. Only the main level has to be accessible. So if it's technically infeasible to get yourself or it would destroy the historic value to put in an elevator or a lift, you only have to make the main level accessible. Only the main entrance has to be accessible, though an alternate entrance could be made accessible, and you only need to provide one accessible unisex restroom. Again, it would these alternates only come into play where it is technically infeasible or it threatens the historic value to otherwise meet the requirements for an alteration. And so I had a building that was historic because of the facade, and they were entirely gutting the building. And so in that situation, it wasn't technically infeasible, nor was it threatening the historic value to modify anything inside the building. And so while it was still on the historic register, it didn't prevent them from making all three levels accessible inside the building and providing accessible restrooms throughout. But if these items would be technically infeasible or threaten historic value, these reductions in scoping are permitted for historic buildings. All right, we finished everything looking at existing buildings, and so we're about halfway through the class almost, but we're now going to jump into new buildings and new construction, and all of those provisions are found in Chapter 11 of IBC. And so the first section, scoping of the IBC, says that all sites, buildings, structures, facilities, elements, and spaces, whether they're temporary or permanent, shall be accessible to persons with disabilities. And then it gives me a list of exceptions: employee work areas, detached dwellings, utility buildings, construction sites, raised areas, limited access areas, equipment spaces, areas and places of religious worship, highway toll booths, residential structures, R1, daycares and Rs, R occupancies, detention facilities, and walk-in cooler freezers. So there are limited scoping requirements if I'm in any one of these items in here. And I'm going to talk about some of the most common ones. One of the ones I will note is the highway toll booths used to say single occupancy structures. They determined that that wasn't a sufficient limitation, so single occupancy structures have to be made accessible, with some exceptions on highway toll booths, which we'll talk about in a moment. So first of all, looking at employee work areas, the number one item I get coming in from an owner is, this is for employees only. Why do I have to make it accessible? I don't hire persons with disabilities. Well, I hope they don't tell me that, because that's illegal and that's against the, they have to hire persons they can't discriminate. That's discrimination. But we'll assume that based on their work requirements, they meant that they have to have fully able-bodied staff. That's great. The code still requires that even if it is just for employees, you still have to be able to approach, enter, and exit the space. So you have to get in, get around, and get out in order to use the space. And then all public areas. Now, again, they say public. Well, it's only open to employees. Well, public is any space such as break rooms, bathrooms, or reception areas in which the public might come in. So areas where the public might come in, or portions of the building that are not being used for work-related purposes. Now, the intent of the code here is the ADA guidelines, and again, we're stepping out of the building code, looking at federal law now. ADA says I have to make reasonable accommodations to my employees. And so if I hire a person with a disability, I must make reasonable accommodations for that individual. And so the building code says we're not going to force an employer to make their workspaces and the work area fully accessible on the off chance that they hire someone with a disability which requires that specific alteration. However, the break rooms, bathrooms, reception areas, these are used by either the public or by all employees for non-work related purposes, in which case if you hire any employee whatsoever that has a disability, these items would need to be fully accessible, and so the code says they have to be fully accessible. So public spaces or spaces to be used for non-work related items by the employees have to be fully accessible, and any area that's open to the public has to be fully accessible. But the individual workstations do not, at least under construction. But again, the owner will be responsible for upgrading those or making reasonable accommodations in the event that someone has a disability later on. So again, equipment such as desks, cubicles, commercial kitchens where it's part of the employee's work job to cook or heat food, laboratory sinks, sinks in medical offices that are used by the doctors, on those items are required to be accessible because they are part of the workspace. Any elevated areas within the workspace that are elevated more than 300, that are less than 300 square feet in size, we don't have to provide access to. So, for example, I had an IT room that they put an access floor in it so that they could run all the electrical wiring and service information in and out of the IT room. And so that elevated floor caused them to go up 3 steps to get into that space. Obviously, that's a space to be used only by employees. It was less than 300 square feet. That doesn't have to be made accessible. Paths in areas less than 1,000 square feet. And so if I'm going into a room or a space, most often I see this as behind the counter. The area behind the counter, getting into behind the counter for a sales floor area, that might be less than 1,000 square feet. I don't have to make that area fully accessible. It's only for employees, it's delineated, and it's less than 1,000 square feet. Or if it's part of the equipment itself, such as catwalks or anything that might be attached to generators or mechanical equipment or things of that nature, they do not have to be made accessible. They're part of that equipment. Uncovered exterior pathways. And so if I have an employee-only area, well, I have several of these warehouse facilities where they might have a fab shop, and then they may have a storage warehouse across the lot in the back area, in the back lot area. And whereas there is not a covered walkway going from the work area back to the storage facility, they don't have to run an accessible route in that location either. Places of religious worship. We've had the opportunity in our office to review, I think 4 now, modifications to the Church of Jesus Christ temples. And we've done it through various code cycles, working our way through, and all of them have this interesting feature inside them. This giant feature right here is a baptismal font. And as we look at that as a code officials, we said, well, what is this? Is this a hot tub? Is this a swimming pool? Is this a bathtub? How do we address this code requirement? Do I need a chairlift to get into this? What's going to be required here? Our first take on it when we looked at it was, well, we'll assume this is an employee work area, right? Because the employee, the pastor, the religious person is going to come in here and perform the sacred rite or whatever it might be. And so that's employee. But ironically, in the Church of Jesus Christ, no one's paid. They're all volunteers. And so there's no pastor, there's no one there that's working. They're all there voluntarily. And so we were just looking at going, well, how do we get out of putting in a chairlift, or do they need to put in a chairlift? The 2018 IBC clarified this and said, hey, if I have a raised or lowered area inside a place of religious worship, and it's less than 300 square feet and more than 7 inches above or below, so 7 inches is 1 step. And so obviously I've got more than 1 step to get into this font. And it's used primarily for the performance of a religious ceremony. It is not required to comply with this chapter. And so this area here is used to perform a baptism. That's a religious ceremony. And they have to go down a set of steps. So I do not need to provide an accessible route to this space. So if someone needed to use this space, they would then be able to just lower the individual in or address those needs as need be, but the building code wouldn't require this space to be accessible. Now, what about a rostrum? I had someone come in and they had a platform in the corner of they put a little stage in where they could present, and they said, well, only the pastor is going to get up on the stage and present, but that's an area less than 300 square feet, 4 steps to get on top. It was more than 7 inches, but that's not where they're performing a religious ceremony. That would be where they're speaking or talking. Same with the choir seats. If you're looking at the choir seats, you still have to provide an accessible route to those. So it's only locations, again, where a religious act or ceremony is being performed, and where it's less than 300 square feet, and it's raised or lowered more than 1 step. General equipment spaces, anything that's a maintenance room, anything that's going to have maintenance equipment in it, something that's only going to be used by maintenance personnel, such as an HVAC room or even perhaps a janitor's closet. These spaces are not required to be accessible under the building code requirements. Booths, highway toll booths, where access is provided only by bridges or above or below in a tunnel, are not required to be accessible. And so as we look at it, the concern is if I make this highway toll booth accessible, it has to be a wider booth. And as I make that wider, I now have to make the whole street wider. So there's a long push not to make these items larger or accessible. But the code has clarified and come in and said that this is all to be fully accessible.
Just think about it.
As long as they only have an accessible route coming straight across the street. So if I park my car as an employee over here and I walk across the street to get to this toll booth, then a person in a wheelchair could park here and come across the street in a wheelchair. Now, if the only way to get to this toll booth was if they had to come up a stair over here, across the bridge, and then lower down into it, it'd be way too expensive. And so the code is now going to allow
on the structural side. So that's good.
We're debating if we should.
No, another item I wanted to highlight on this is that complying with this chapter, I'm going to take a pause. I know I'm getting some feedback here. Could everybody please make sure that
the goal is to place
their mics are muted?
And if we like them after 6 months, then we can.
Really?
Yeah. George
There's a comment that says, what if I have a second floor less than 1,000 square feet? Does it require an accessible toilet?
I don't know that I saw it.
Excuse me.
Yes, a toilet room is not considered part of the workspace. And so that's a public space, even if it's for employees only, and it would need to be made accessible.
With a few exceptions.
Excuse me, we're getting feedback. Somebody has their mic open.
For us, or
Would you please close your mic?
But we might keep you if we like you.
We can't tell who it is, but
We're working out some of those.
I don't like either of those. I don't. Why?
You just want to hire them to keep them.
Why? Yeah. Why am I going to hire somebody?
excuse
Okay,
me.
I think I know who it is.
Because
Give me 1 second. I think that's on my end.
Spend lots of money on them
Hello?
and then just place them somewhere else.
Yeah.
Why?
Okay,
why?
give me 1 second. Let me see if I can pull this up. Let me mute my mic and see if I can fix this. Sorry.
My concern is there's, well, like I said,
I mean, if things-
How do I mute my mic? Here we go.
Risk, but it's a lot of risk. A lot of these kids, they're young. They don't even know if they want to do this as a career, kind of, you know what I mean? But,
Yeah.
So.
But what's the risk if you're hiring them as an intern?
Yeah.
If they work out, you keep them. If they don't, you let them loose.
Well, yeah, that's true.
And,
Yeah,
and when we let them loose, we can say, hey, we've given you all these skills and you should be marketable with all these different jurisdictions, and watch your emails for when they have postings. But,
Yeah, for sure. I just think it should be a predetermined time on it.
Okay, sorry about that. I think it was on our end. It was coming in through my speakers, and I was trying to figure out a way to get that shut off. So I've got that taken care of now. Sorry,
All right.
I apologize for that.
Thank you so much.
All right, so I answered the question about the second floor. It looks like, yeah, toilet rooms are not considered employee spaces, so they can't use the 1,000 square feet or other exceptions to get out of that. I have an old historic building for my business with 2 employees. I want to add another bathroom, so I have a dedicated men's and women's toilets. I don't normally have clients that come in. Does my new toilet room need to meet ADA? Yes, the new toilet room has to meet ADA. Now, if it is an historic building and the modification, the addition of a toilet would be, making it ADA compliant would either be technically infeasible, which seems unlikely because it would indicate that you'd have to move a structural wall, or if it would destroy the historic nature of the building, then you could not make that bathroom accessible. But generally, anytime you add a bathroom, it always has to be made accessible. I have a back bar where the bartenders work. It does not need to be accessible. If so, why is a 3-foot opening required instead of a flip top? Okay, I don't know which building official enforced that. It happens all the time. The 3-foot opening instead of a flip top. Actually, I do know what that requirement is. The 3-foot opening, it's not actually 3 feet. It only needs to be 30 inches, 30 and 32 inches clear width. That is an egress requirement for exiting, and flip tops don't meet exiting requirements. So that's the issue. You need to have a swing door if you have an occupant load over 10, but otherwise you have to have a door that meets maneuvering clearance and has a 3-foot opening. So that's an egress, not an accessibility requirement. You're right. The back bar area would not need to be accessible. So yeah, it looks like there might be another question here. I have a 2nd-story office building. I'm doing an alteration on the 2nd floor that does not have an accessible route or elevator. Can I claim that providing equivalent facilities on the 1st floor to avoid installing an elevator? No, the idea of equivalent facilities only shows up in certain public facilities, such as assembly spaces, that you provide equivalent dining facilities or equivalent other things. All items on the 2nd floor have to be made accessible, whether or not there is an elevator to the 2nd floor or not. They must be fully accessible, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Also, there you do have to provide a bathroom on the main floor, even if there isn't an accessible route. That is one that would have to be provided. So those are just some clarifications that you might be looking at there. So if I have a 2-story office building, I'm doing an alteration, that's the case. The other one to look at is, as long as it exceeds the cost cap, you wouldn't need to install the elevator. You still need to make the features on the 2nd floor accessible. And the other one is if the 2nd floor doesn't require an accessible route. We'll talk about that. If it's under 3,000 square feet, has an occupant load less than 5, or one of the other alterations that would not require an accessible route, those will get you out of it. But providing accessible features on an accessible floor will not. Okay, I think that addresses those comments and questions that were listed in the QA menu. One of the items I do want to highlight here while I'm on this slide is to take a look right here. The language has changed in the 2015 code and is perpetuated in the 2018 code as well. Is this section says that these spaces are not required to comply with the phrases this chapter. IBC used to use the language, they're not required to be accessible. And that was a dangerous phrase because, again, the accessibility requirements, while the building code is enforcing them somewhat, are really brought in under ADA guidelines, which is federal law. And just because the building code says that something is not required to be accessible, that's only talking about the scoping of the building code requirements. This does not trump, supersede, or get out of accessibility requirements under ADA guidelines. And so, for example, on equipment spaces, I might tell you as a building official, or you may tell your client as an architect, that the mop sink in the janitor's closet does not need to be made accessible because it is a workspace. Great, wonderful, awesome, they get out of it. Until a janitor comes in that's in a wheelchair, or a janitor comes in that has specific needs. And now they are under the obligation to hire this individual unless they have other reasoning not to do so. And so that's where the problem comes into play, that they may now have to make that accessible or provide an alternate feature or reasonable accommodation for a person that may have a disability. So again, just be clear that just because the building code doesn't require an item or grants you an exception to get out of an item, this is for the building code scoping, not necessarily getting you out of ADA requirements. So just be aware of that and make sure that your owner is aware that a lot of times it's easier to make things accessible from the get-go than to modify them later down the road. And the other one is that when it comes down to it, I often say that, you know, when you think about it, when you walk into a public toilet room, how many of us use the wheelchair stall because it's more accommodating? Or how many of us prefer to use the easy to handle door handles or other accessibility features? When pushing my kids around when they were young and they were in a stroller, I was really grateful for the ADA push doors where I could more easily navigate a stroller through a doorway. So most people prefer accessible requirements. So it's not just for people that are disabled, it's beneficial in general. So just be aware that those are some items that we're not covering today. All right, next up, taking a look at this. Okay, double swing doors, can they be used as egress like for commercial kitchen doors? No, so a door that swings both, a door that swings both directions can be used for egress, but that's kind of an egress requirement. That's capped to no more than serving an area, no more than 50 occupants as a door that swings in both directions. A new valet drop-off area that can't be raised to a zero curb due to elevations at street level. So I'm adding a valet and I don't have a curb. That the issue you're going to run into is that the drop-off zone has to be adjacent, and so if you were installing a valet drop-off area, you would have to remodel the site, either cut the sidewalk down or modify it to get you into a situation where the drop-off lane is at the same elevation as the drive lane. And as long as you can create the drive lane and the drop-off lane at the same elevation, you could do a curb cut up to a sidewalk or otherwise address it. But this is something where if a valet drop-off zone does not exist and you want to install a new one, you would have to make it compliant somehow. I'm altering and expanding my owner's office on the second floor of the apartment building. Do I need an accessible bathroom and route? The area is 700 square feet and the tenant go to the rental office on the first floor. Yes, so the owner's office is an apartment building. And so if the question I guess comes down to, is that the primary function of the building? And so if it's an apartment complex and there is a leasing space, I would probably say you're pretty safe in betting that the leasing space is not the primary function of an apartment complex. And so you might be able to get out of saying, hey, no, I don't have to meet that. If you have a larger office area and it's a separated occupancy or a non-separated occupancy, it's not accessory, now it might qualify as an office area, a B occupancy, and now the office itself, the owner's office, is part of the primary function that you're modifying. And so in that case, it would trigger a bathroom. You would need an accessible route to the bathroom. Again, you're looking most likely at the cost cap limitations where you're saying, hey, how much money am I actually spending to upgrade the office? And then how much money would it cost to provide an accessible route from that office to the location of the bathroom? All right, I think we've addressed some of these. I have a 2-story office building. Okay, we've talked about that one as well. A condominium project where the units are rented for vacation properties. Is the pool, bathhouse required to be accessibly upgraded? And so I'm going to talk about that shortly, but yes, so it depends on what you're altering. If you provide or add a pool into a building and it's used for vacation property rentals, 100% of those have to be made accessible, yes. However, if you're just making modifications to the building and not the pool itself, and your alteration doesn't accept it, it's not going to be brought into scoping requirements, so you will not have to meet those requirements. Okay. So someone's asking about how to see the questions. There is a little, on the bottom of your screen, you can highlight the little button that says Q&A. If you click that, it'll open the question and answer questions. What is the accessibility requirements for an elevated control room in an industrial space less than 300 square feet? If it's for employees only, elevated spaces less than 300 square feet do not have to be made part of an accessible route. If they're for maintenance personnel, regardless of the size, as long as they're only used by maintenance personnel going in to check equipment, they never have to be made accessible. All right, jumping back in on the presentation, looking at daycare facilities. Now I say daycare facilities, and the reason I say this is because I live in Utah, and I swear every third house down the street has a daycare built into it, especially now that we're dealing with COVID and people are having to work from home and find childcare options. And so as we look at these different things, what accessibility requirements happen when I have a daycare inside an RE occupancy? Well, first of all, the daycare itself has to be fully accessible. So every portion where the kids outside the home are being treated. Now, granted, I want to highlight Utah has amendments that get you out of this, and your local jurisdictions may also have amendments that change this when you're inside a single family dwelling. But if you're going straight out of the IBC code requirements, the daycare portion where the kids may be located inside a dwelling unit must be fully accessible. So as you're looking at it, as the kitchen is being used to service kids, or any of this space here, this would all have to be made accessible. Accessible routes, accessible hardware, etc. This includes accessible parking and accessible entrance to the space, and where bathrooms are required, and I would assume if it's a daycare that the kids will need to use the bathroom, an accessible bathroom, toilet room, I should say, not bathroom, an accessible toilet room should be provided. If this is located in a single family dwelling that's been done per the IRC, there are no accessibility requirements in the IRC for individual dwelling units. And so the rest of the home, which includes the daycare, does not need to be accessible. So only the portions where the children are as part of the daycare need to be accessible. In multifamily construction, if you're doing this, IBC 1107 is going to have requirements for when this is allowed, and these are typically going to be type B units, as long as you have 4 or more inside the dwelling units inside the building, intended as residences. And so then the dwelling portion, the live portion, would have to meet the requirements of a type B facility, but the remainder of the space would be accessible. You are allowed to share elements between the work and the live area, but anything that's shared, for example, this kitchen, if it was to be used by the employees as well as by the person that's living there, this would have to be fully 100% accessible. So if any of the shared items must meet full accessibility requirements. Any of the items that are just for the live area may meet the reduced living requirements for either a type B or may not need to be accessible if it's an IRC building. This is the exact same for all live work facilities. So any of the live work facilities under the IBC are required to be type B units, type B accessible, and so the live portion is type B, the work portion is going to be fully accessible and meeting these requirements. All right, looking at buildings in general, when I take a look at a set, at least one route within the site has to provide an accessible entrance. So I have to provide a route from all of the following to the building entrance. One, if there's a public transit, and so that little keynote 20 is for a bus stop. I have to have a route from the bus stop all the way over to my building entrance. Notice I'm missing curb cuts as I go along there. The sidewalk, I would need to have a curb cut down to the sidewalk to get down to the asphalt to get across the parking lot, and then another curb cut getting back up. The accessible parking at the main entrance of the building has to have an accessible route getting me to the building entrance. If I had a drop-off or loading zone, I have to have an accessible route there. I have to have a route from a public street. Now, there is an exception that if the only way to the building is a vehicular route, and so this happens a lot of times for industrial complexes where the only way to get to the building is to drive up to the building. Then in that situation, you do not have to have an accessible route. But most buildings, even Walmarts, you can walk up to them. And if you can walk up to them, an accessible route is required from at least one of the public ways to the building entrance. And that includes public sidewalks. Now, a question I get asked all the time is, notice the curb cuts are missing on the sidewalk. If it's part of the city's jurisdiction, the city is responsible for meeting accessibility requirements. But if you're installing it as part of your remodel or as part of the scope of your project, I would strongly recommend that instead of just meeting the city guidelines, you meet ADA guidelines as well, just because you have control over it. All right, accessible routes to additional stories. So what happens when I have a multi-story building, such as this weird shaped black and white building here? First of all, I have to have an accessible route. The governing language says every story has to have an accessible route. Every mezzanine must have an accessible route. The first exception is that mezzanines and stories, if they're less than 3,000 square feet aggregate in area, and they're located above or below an accessible floor level, are not required to be accessible. So as long as the total area of all the mezzanines in the building or the total area of all the stories in the building that are not on an accessible route is less than 3,000, that's what the word aggregate means, total, they don't have to be there. So you're allowed up to 3,000 square feet of stories or mezzanines in a building that are not on an accessible route. Stories and mezzanines not containing accessible elements. Now, this doesn't mean, and we talked about this a little earlier with the question that we had, stories or mezzanines, that just because you provide the same features on another story doesn't mean that you don't have to have accessible features on that story, on the other story. So when the code says a story does not contain accessible elements, this is similar to an apartment complex that has no elevator and just has stairs. The dwelling units on the second, third, or fourth floor of that apartment complex are not required to be on an accessible route. And because there's an exception in the code that says they're not required to be on an accessible route, there are no accessible elements on those stories, therefore an accessible route is not required to those stories. So be aware that you'd have to have a story or mezzanine in which there are exceptions that say nothing on that level is required to be accessible, and then in that situation, the accessible route to that level can be omitted. And I will talk about a few of those items in a few minutes here. Air traffic control towers, or get out of it. And if I have a two-story building, the story that has less than and I have a story that has less than 5 occupants on it, that story, regardless of how large it is, does not have to have an accessible route. Please remember that this exception applies only to the accessible route and not to the facilities or other items on that story. So if I have a bathroom on the 2nd floor of a building, even though it's less than 3,000 square feet, I don't have an elevator to that story, the bathroom has to be fully accessible. The break room has to be fully accessible. Turning spaces are required in each of the rooms. So again, the accessibility provisions apply more to the just persons in wheelchairs. And as we look at these items, you only get out of the accessible route or the elevator requirement here. All right, question coming in from the group. Lighting required. A 1-foot candle for the accessible route from the public right-of-way must be on a 90-minute battery backup. It goes the other way around, actually. The battery backup is required for egress. And so it is part of the accessible means of egress from a building. And yes, the 2018 code clarified that the egress from the building all the way to the public way must be provided with lighting, and that lighting requires a 90-minute backup. And so if I'm in a building, well, right now at 5 o'clock in Utah, it's dark outside. And so as I'm leaving the office at 5 o'clock, it's already dark outside. If the building's on fire at 5 o'clock, I have to be able to get all the way to the public way. And so I need a battery backup light on the outside of the building that can show me how to cross the parking lot and get there. And that would apply as well to the accessible route. But that is part of the accessible means of egress. Not all of the accessible routes need to be provided with that backup. That's a egress requirement. That's a good question there. So if I do have to provide an accessible route to my stories, how do I do that? Well, there are 4 options in the IBC. And the IBC allows you to use a ramp at any time. I have now finally, after 10 years, seen 1 second floor of a building with ramp access. It's not very common that you'll do a story-to-story access, but this one had a ramp servicing the 2nd floor. So yes, you can do it by a ramp, but it takes a lot of space. You can use a limited use, limited access, or a LULA. That's just fun to say. LULA, LULA, LULA. It's a smaller elevator, and that is allowed anytime to provide your accessible route, or you can provide a full-size elevator. Now, there are occasions in which a platform lift can be used. Now remember, in existing buildings, a platform lift is always allowed, but in new construction, there are very limited applications where a platform lift may be installed. So this is a platform lift. It looks a lot like this. It's going to be something you get into, it hoists you up, and you get over there. This is, oh, hit the wrong button there, guys, sorry. This is also a platform lift. It goes on a stair and it takes you up as a stair lift, and it can qualify as well as a platform lift. Be very careful about these, because that lift right here is not permitted to reduce the required egress width of the stair, nor is it allowed to infringe on the required handrails for the stair. So you have to have a handrail on both sides, and if you have more than 30 inches away from the handrail, you might have to have an intermediate handrail. So this is a wide enough stair, this will probably work, but just be aware that these cannot impede the egress requirements if you're going to install them. Yeah, there are issues with LULAs and platform lifts. Someone's pointing out as the rise requirements for each state. Yes, so depending on how your state regulates elevators and lifts, there are situations in that case where there may be restrictions on when they can and can't be used based on where they're at. Also be aware that there's a difference between a lift for supplies and a lift for individuals. There are maximum lift requirements and there are maximum rise requirements for lifts. So there are limitations where lifts cannot be used because maybe your story-to-story height is too high. They can't be used because you're not using one that's approved for persons. So there are things that you do need to be careful for. They're not a catch-all. Thank you for bringing that up. So where they are allowed in new buildings is in Group A performing areas. So if I'm trying to get to the stage from the dressing room, I can use a platform lift. Dispersed seating, and so if I'm trying to get to my wheelchair seating, I can, inside an assembly area, I can do that. If I have an area of the building that has an occupant load less than 5 individuals, I can provide a lift to that space. Dwelling inside individual dwelling and sleeping units, if I have a mezzanine that needs to have an accessible route inside my dwelling unit, I can do that via a lift. Courtrooms, I can get to and from any of the elevated areas in a courtroom. Amusement rides, they're very common in amusement rides for transfer systems. Playground equipments, another location to get you up to the elevated surfaces. Player seating, if you need to get lowered into the dugout, this is an option. Boating or fishing piers, the same. This last one is probably the most common location I see them in new construction, is that the exterior has site conditions which don't allow things to be done. So I see all the time in downtown areas particularly, and we live in a nice mountainous area here in Utah, and there's plenty of mountains out there in Nevada as well, in which zoning requirements forces you to build right up next to the public sidewalk. But there's too much slope, and so we have these large stoops outside, but there's not enough room to get a ramp outside to get you up to the building entrance as you're changing elevations, as you're on a steep hill, because the public right-of-way is on a 6% or a 7% slope. So how do we address this? Well, where we have those site conditions, a lift could be used to get you from the public way up into the building entrance. Does every toilet room on a second floor need to be accessible, or just one for each gender, or one unisex? I'm going to put that on hold, Douglas, and I'll talk about that when I get to toilets. And then you talk about executive office as well, and I'm going to put that on hold as well for when I jump onto toilets, because I talk about those both specifically on a future slide. Location of the accessible route, it has to be the same as the circulation path. If the circulation path is inside the building, the accessible route must stay inside the building. I run into this problem all the time. I cannot go outside to go up a ramp to get back into the building. If the person inside the building can get around inside the building, the person that's disabled has to be able to do the same. I can't pass through kitchens, storage rooms, restrooms, or closets. Similar to egress, I'm just worried about those spaces being congested and not being able to properly move. In a new, oh, that question got yanked. Public entrances, 60% of all public entrances do have to be made accessible. This is a wonderful magic rule that says if I have 2 entrances, both have to be accessible, but if I have 3 or more, I only have to have 2 or a percentage thereof. So that's why the magic number came in at 60%. If I have an entrance from a parking garage into the building, they have to be accessible. So watch out for this. You cannot have stairs going from the parking garage into the building. So enclosed egress stairs, yes, you can have that. That's not really the entrance. The entrance, we're going to say, is the elevator. But you can't have access stairs leading up into the building at one location. So from the parking garage, again, this is an enclosed parking garage, which is part of the structure, or an open parking garage, which is part of the structure. Their entrance to the buildings have to be accessible. Where the following are provided, at least one has to be accessible. If I have an elevator or a tunnel getting into the building, they have to be accessible. Restricted entrances is any entrance which requires a key or a key fob to get in. Watch out for these, particularly on employee-only entrances or tenant or resident-only entrances for hotels and apartment complexes. So at least one of the restricted entrances has to be accessible. Inmates, detainees, each individual tenant space has to have an accessible, and all type A, type B, or type accessible dwelling units have to have an accessible entrance. Parking and passenger loading facilities. I think you guys have all seen this table before. What I want to highlight is the separate calculation for each parking lot and each structure in the parking lot. So if I have a front and rear parking lot, I would add them up separately. I'm not normally picky on that, but if I had a surface parking lot and an enclosed parking garage, those would add up separately in the table. I'd go to this table once for the surface lot, I'd go to the table once for the parking garage. In I1, R1, R2, R3, and R4 occupancies, these are ones that have dwelling units. We'll have some separate requirements. In hospitals, 10% of all stalls in hospitals have to be accessible. If they have rehabilitation, this is physical rehabilitation, not drug rehab, guys. Physical rehabilitation, we're going to go to 20% of the stalls have to be accessible. And then 1 out of 6 stalls have to be van accessible. And they would be marked with the van accessibility requirements. I have a second level boarding house that we are upgrading electrical and plumbing. Do I need to provide a lift to get up to the existing stair? Again, going back to the IEBC, as long as your remodel is only plumbing and mechanical, HVAC and plumbing, the code says no. Now, if you're upgrading a bathroom, you would have to make that bathroom fully accessible, but as long as you're limiting it to mechanical plumbing, you do not have to upgrade your accessible route. I1, R1s, so there are provisions in R2s, R3s, and R4s. If you have an accessible type A or type B unit in the facility, then 2% of each type of parking stall has to be accessible. This is going to be 2% of tenant parking, 2% of visitor parking, 2% of covered parking, 2% of garage parking, 2% of private garage parking, 2% of underground parking. So just be aware that it's going to be 2% of each different type of parking facility that you provide. I1s or R1s, these are more public facilities. And so we're going to go right back to table 1106.1, but we're going to clarify that I have to have at least 1 stall for each of the type A or type accessible units, where provided for each unit. So if I have assigned stalls, so in my R1 occupancy in a hotel or my apartment complex, if every single unit has an assigned parking stall, then the accessible or type A dwelling unit, the stall assigned to that unit must be an accessible stall. That is, even if it exceeds the 2%, or if it exceeds the number here as well, that doesn't matter. So there's several R1 occupancies that may require a higher level, or I1 facilities that may require a higher level of accessible units. And there are R4s where up to 50% of these might be accessible units, and 1 accessible stall must be provided if a parking stall is designated. So be careful about designated stalls. This applies to, again, parking within or beneath the building. Watch out for garages in apartment complexes. All right, another question. Will I touch on EV parking? Only because you asked me to, John. So EV parking, the 2018 code has new provisions in the code which state, and this is the language of the code, that EV parking, where provided, shall be accessible per Chapter 11. And then if you read through Chapter 11, you will find no reference whatsoever to EV parking. So what does that mean scoping wise? It's up to the building official's interpretation practically. If you want some good references, I would recommend going to the CBC. The CBC has some good provisions in there for EV parking. I believe the 2021 IBC, I haven't read through it close enough, additionally has some provisions for EV parking. The first thing I want to point out is an EV charging station, and I'm one of those people that drives an electric vehicle. EV parking stations are somewhat problematic because they are not parking stalls. If you drive an electric vehicle, you'll find out as you pull up into an EV charging station, there's a big sign there always that says, for charging only. And so, for example, I went to an all-day convention, and in the end of the day, I'm like, you know what, I'm just going to, thankfully I have a hybrid car, so it jumps from back and forth on electrical and gas. So I just jumped off of, I just didn't charge my car because I would have to go to park it, charge it for 2 hours, then leave the convention, go back to my car, relocate it to another location because you cannot leave your car there for more than 2 hours, more than it takes to charge the vehicle. And so the reason I point that out is when you look at them, considering them parking spaces is kind of inappropriate because, again, if you came in and said, well, I'm going to label one of my van parking stalls as a charging station, you've essentially lost an accessible parking stall because the person that's disabled or wants to use that stall can now only use it while they're charging their vehicle. They can't keep their vehicle there at all times. So that becomes problematic. What is clear is that the charging station itself must be accessible. So all charging stations have to have operable parts within the reach range. Now there are exceptions, we'll talk about it later, about fueling, that you can have pinching and grasping for fueling stations. And so I would say that that would apply as well for charging stations. So the actual handle on the charging station can still function. But you will need an accessible space, a 30 by 48 inch clear floor space in front of the charging station that is not going to be overrun by the parking stall. So wherever they're parking their vehicle can't overlap that space. They need to have an accessible route leading from their car up to that space. My recommendations, this is my personal opinion, not code, is that I treat them as a separate parking facility. And so as we looked at on the previous two slides, that I go to that table and I say, based on the number of parking stalls I have, I will provide accessible stalls. And so I would go in and say, all right, I have 15 charging stations. I would go to the table in 1106.1. I would look at charging, I would say 15 stalls, or how many I said I had of charging stations. I have 15 charging stations. I'd look at 15 parking spaces, and I would provide that many accessible parking spaces, providing them a clear floor space adjacent to the location with the access aisle. There is no clear-cut requirement that the charging station has to have an access aisle adjacent to it. But all charging stations have to have a clear floor space in front of them, and all charging stations have to be located on an accessible route because they're operable parts. I hope that kind of answers the questions, but it is very vague right now as to how that is addressed. Parking must be along the shortest route. When there are multiple entrances, you must disperse the parking near all entrances. I want to highlight this because it gets missed. In multi-level parking garages, the van parking is allowed on one level. That's a wonderful exception, and the reason why is because vans have a much higher clear height requirement, and so we don't want to do that on every level of a parking garage. But notice that if there's an exception that says the van parking is allowed on one level, there is no exception saying that non-van parking is allowed to be put on one level. And the code says it must be dispersed. And so if I have a multi-level parking garage, I cannot put all the accessible parking on just one level. It has to be dispersed throughout the levels. Second of all, if I have multiple accessible entrances, typically I have I'll give an example of a hotel. You can't put all the accessible parking spaces at the front of the hotel because you'll have restricted entrances in the back of the hotel which lead up to your room. And so you'll have to put at least one accessible stall, disperse it over towards the restricted accessible entrance. So be careful that they're not all just getting put in front of one location. The other perpetrator that I see all the time is in multi-building apartment complexes, where we'll put all the accessible parking spaces in front of just one of the buildings. And we can't do that. We need to disperse it throughout so that there's accessible parking near each of the accessible entrances for the type A, type B units. I can always relocate them. And so if I have a parking garage in the front of my building and I have a parking garage behind my building, and the entrance to the building is in the front, I can easily take all the accessible stalls that would be required in the parking lot behind my building and put them in the parking lot in front of my building because they're equivalent in distance, fee, and convenience. But I can't take them out of the underground parking and put them in the above ground at-grade parking because that's not similar in fee or convenience. Passenger loading zones, these are my drop-off zones. Where I have a continuous loading zone, I have to have an accessible loading zone for each 100 feet that I have continuous loading zone. Medical facilities, this is the one place in the code where it requires it and says whether or not you plan on installing one, you have to have an accessible drop-off zone at a hospital that provides 24-hour care. If you have valet parking, you also have to provide a passenger loading. Now, I didn't see this a long time ago when I started putting this slide together, but mechanical access parking is becoming much more popular. This is the automobile vending machine. And in all honesty, the building code considers it that, a giant vending machine, or more accurately, a giant piece of equipment. This is not, as you look at it, I've got 8 cars, 9 cars, 12 cars sitting inside this facility. This is not 12 parking spaces. The city zoning enforcement might tell you that that qualifies for 12 cars. But as far as the building code is concerned, this is not even a parking space. This is a piece of equipment that cars are put into. And so if I have one of these facilities in there, I don't count these towards the number of parking spaces I have and determine the number of accessible stalls I need to provide. What the code says is at the drop-off that I have to provide a passenger loading and drop-off zone, an accessible drop-off zone at the drop-off and pickup location for these vehicles. And so if you drive in and pull out on the same side, so if they were to drive in over here and then pull out over here, I would have to have a drop-off zone over here. Somewhere where I can pull up, let grandma out of the car, and then go park it, and grandma can go get into the building. And then when I'm going to pick up grandma, as long as I can pull out to the same side, I'm fine. But now if this parking garage, I can pull in on this side, but I have to pull out on the opposite side. Now I have to put a pickup zone on the other side so that as I'm coming out of the building, I can go pick up grandma after I get my vehicle. So remember, the mechanical access parking spaces are not parking spaces. This is a single piece of equipment as far as the building code is concerned. And what you do is you provide a drop-off zone. By providing the drop-off zone, you've essentially made all of these spaces accessible. Can you go through a commercial kitchen as egress if you have a 36-inch clear width? That's more of an egress question, but I'll jump into that. No, you cannot egress through a commercial kitchen, period. And your accessible route can't go through that either. Assembly seating areas, same as service. This is where we talk about providing a same service. So whatever services you provide to people that are have no disabilities, that are fully able-bodied, you have to provide the same service to persons that are accessible. So I was talking about this in a theater, and this is where things get tricky. They wanted to put a cry room in a movie theater. And if that is a facility or a service that's going to be provided to persons without disabilities, that's a service that has to be provided to persons with disabilities. If you have a dining theater or an area where you can eat food, it has to be done the same way. And so I ran into this we were doing oh man, I can't even think of the name of it. We had a luxury booth. We had several luxury booths in this auditorium. And as they looked at the luxury booth, they had a dining table, and then they had seating, and the seating area had a little tray that you could put your food onto. And so we came in and said, no, the seating has to be fully accessible, but the dining table at chairs has to now be accessible, because you're providing a service where I can sit and watch the show and eat my food as an able-bodied individual. And so a person with a disability has to have the exact same feature. If I provide chairs, wheelchair seating, I will opine on Kelly's question. I don't consider a break room a kitchen, and so I would allow egress through one. I have had building officials fall on that a different way. So that being said, for accessibility, break rooms are kitchens, and they do have to be made accessible. So wheelchair spaces are typically how we make general seating accessible, but just be aware if you provide different features or services, you have to provide separate services as well. Those wheelchair spaces have to be provided in locations with separate services. You go to this table, based on the number of seating you have, determines the number of accessible wheelchair spaces you have to provide. General seating, you just go straight to this table. If you have luxury boxes, every single luxury box is counted individually. So for each luxury box, you jump to this table by itself and you address it. And so every luxury box in the facility will have some accessible seating within it. For all other boxes, you still go to this table, but instead of going to the table for every box, you can take all the seating, all the luxury boxes you have, and add the seating together from all the boxes and go to the table just once. But the accessible seating must be dispersed such that at least 20% of your boxes, so if I have 5 boxes, at least 1 has to be accessible. If I have 6 boxes, at least 2 of them have to have accessible seating within them. Team and player seating, I must have at least one of the team seatings there. So if I have an example of a dugout at a baseball stadium, I would have to have at that baseball field, at least one of the 2 dugouts would have to have an accessible route and have accessible wheelchair seating. The wheelchair seat, we're going to assume that persons in wheelchairs are not going to these events by themselves and must be provided with a companion seat. The companion seat is not an accessible seat whatsoever. It's just adjacent to the wheelchair space so they can sit with someone. Dispersion, you have to disperse them on the main floor level and then 1 for each of the additional 2 levels. And so we've kind of talked about this, but if I'm in a theater and it has a main level, a mezzanine, and a second story, the main level has to have wheelchair seating, and then either the mezzanine or the second floor has to have one. If I have a main level and a second floor and that's it, no mezzanine, the main level has to have one. And well, even though it's only one additional story, the second floor has to have one as well. So I can't skip a level until I have at least 2 levels, additional levels above the main level, if that makes sense to you. So just be careful as we look at that. How does the code distinguish between luxury boxes and other boxes? The code does not distinguish, the designer does. So that's up to you to tell them what a luxury box is and what it is not. How ADA is going to govern it is basically saying, are you providing different features in this box than the other boxes? If all the boxes you have the same features available to them, then there are no such thing as a luxury box. But if certain boxes have better features, like maybe a box has a kitchen or a dining area, or maybe one of them is catered, then that would be considered a luxury box because it provides a service different than what the other boxes provide. But I did another facility and they only had 2 boxes. And I did another one that had 8 boxes and they were all the exact same. So as long as the boxes are all the same, none of them are considered luxury because the boxes are all identical. Some exceptions, and I want to highlight this. If I'm in an area that's for worship, with less than 25% on the seats, I don't have to have, on the mezzanine, I don't have to have any wheelchair seats on the mezzanine. This is one of those cases where I'm going to point out that mezzanine doesn't need to have an accessible route if all it provides is seating and there's less than 25% of the seating on that floor. This exception gets you out of making that floor that mezzanine accessible. And so now I don't have accessible features. So now that mezzanine doesn't have to be on an accessible route. The same situation applies to any building with a mezzanine as long as they're less than 300 occupants. So unlimited occupants in a worship area, in an assembly area with less than 300 seats, as long as I have less than 25% of those on the mezzanine, it doesn't need to be done. And then there's no dispersion required in player seating. And so in that situation, if I had that dugout situation, again, if there was a bench for the players at grade and another bench down below, I would not have to provide the wheelchair seating at the lower level. I could provide it at the at grade level, as long as there was player seating in both locations. Designated aisle seats. This is the #1 item. I'm going to say that again, #1 item that gets missed in assembly seating. We remember the wheelchairs, we remember the companion seats, but we forget designated aisle seats. So I went and watched a play a while back, and I don't actually go to playhouses very often, but it was the Glass Menagerie, and so I decided I had to see it. And as I watched the play, I sat in the middle of the seat and was watching. I sat in the middle of the row. I realized that the demographic for watching plays, and maybe this is the reason I don't go to them very often, is predominantly older individuals. And as I was looking at that group of individuals, I realized that several of them are ambulatory. They could walk, but they were walking with a walker or a cane. And as they came down the aisle, that was one thing. But then maneuvering down the access aisleway in between the seats was very complicated. And this is the concern, is it's very hard if you're semi-ambulatory or if you're ambulatory with some disability to be able to negotiate down the row of seating. And so what the code says is at least 5% of the seats on the aisle need to be designated for persons with disabilities. This is not a wheelchair. This is an ambulatory person who just can't walk down the row. And so you have to reserve the seat on the end for them. And what the code says is you just put the international symbol of accessibility there, and that seat is then reserved for someone that has a disability, and that's 5% of all your seats have to be done that way, and they have to be the seats nearest to the accessible route. And so if the accessible route comes into the bottom, that's where all your wheelchair seats are. As you move up the aisleway, the first 5% of aisle seats are the ones that should be designated as designated aisle seats. If you provide an armrest for the individuals from the rest of the chair, you have to provide an armrest for the aisle seat. Now here's the problem. The aisle seat armrest makes it difficult to get in and out. So that armrest has to be a liftable arm seat armrest, so it can lift up out of their way so they can just sit down directly in the chair, and then the armrest can come back into place. Lawn seating, this is kind of an anomaly, but if you have lawn seating, they put chairs out on this lawn seating, but if you have lawn seating, the accessible route just comes up to the edge of the lawn. You don't actually have to ride accessible route across the lawn. Now in this situation, they put fixed chairs out here, so now this is actual seating. It's not sitting on a blanket and eating on the lawn. If you have chairs, they did have to come in and put a surface, a flat, smooth surface leading to the accessible seating that was provided for this area, and it had to be dispersed throughout. But as long as you're out just in the lawn and grass, it just comes up to the edge. The accessible route just comes to the edge of the grass. Audio amplification. Any time a building has audio amplification, speakers or microphones that's used for an assembly purpose, you must have this sign and you must provide receivers per 1108.7. If you have a ticket window, and the ticket window has one of the little mics that they speak through and talk to you that you can't understand them as they ask you how many tickets you want, you have to have an assisted listening device available at that ticket window as well. And then the public address systems, if you have a Jumbotron serving more than 15,000 people, closed captioning must be provided. Performance areas, I've run into this before, so if I have a stage or a platform, first of all, if I provide a route from the seating area onto the stage, you have to provide an accessible route. If there is no route from the seating area to the stage, you don't have to do that. So I've been in one play in my life, and that is it. And it just so happened that in that play, I had a scene that I entered the stage through the audience. So I came in from the back of the audience, I ran down the aisle, and then I ran up onto the stage. And so I was getting up the stage, and you can see them right here. If you have a large enough screen, you can see that there is a set of stairs right here coming from the seating area up onto the stage. And so because there is a route onto the stage that's non-accessible, a ramp, which is located right here, must also be provided up onto that stage from the seating area. I also went to a conference, and it was, I think it was Jason Momoa was up there, and it landed into a huge problem because they invited someone from the audience up, and the first person that came up just walked up the stairs, and the second person that was invited up was in a wheelchair, and they had to stop the conference and wait almost 10, 15 minutes to find a way to get the wheelchair into the back room and then up onto the stage. And so be very careful. Again, that's the issue. You can't provide a service to persons that are fully able-bodied and not provide one to persons who are not. The second one is an accessible route must always be provided for the performers. And so I had one where, I don't know why, they want to do these spiral stairs and have the changing rooms located up above the stage. And as they were looking at that, we came in and said, no, if you have a changing room up there, an accessible route must be provided for the performer onto the stage. Now, this is one of the locations where a platform lift can be used. Dining and drinking facilities, 100% of the dining area must be on an accessible route. The exception is if I have a non-accessible level or if I have less than 25% of the seating. So 1104.4 tells me that if I was less than 3,000 square feet, if you guys remember, I don't have to make that level accessible. And so if my restaurant is less than 3,000 square feet on the second story of the building, I don't have to provide an accessible route to that level. Or if I have a dining area and it has a mezzanine like this dining area has here, where the majority are down here at the bottom, and then I have some up at the top in the dining area, as long as less than 25% of the seats are up on this mezzanine, I don't have to provide an accessible route to them. And so that's the exception, again, where we talked about 1104.4, where no accessible features are required on this level because the seating is less than 25%. And so I don't even have to, even if this mezzanine is over 3,000 square feet, I could be exempt from an accessible route as long as less than 25% of the seating was on that mezzanine. 5% of all the dining surfaces must be accessible. Please be aware that this also includes bars. Okay, so if I have seating at a bar, 5% of the seating at the bar must also be accessible. And in order to qualify as accessible seating, you need knee toe clearance underneath, and the bar would have to have knee toe clearance underneath for a forward approach. So that's normally my biggest issue with bars, is they have to extend the counter to create an accessible 5% accessible seating. So here's my dad joke for the day. That is self-storage, right? I'm storing it on myself. Self-storage facilities, these are the worst to plan or review. They're normally done really cheaply and not well put together. They don't normally hire architects. That's the problem. The engineer tries to design it himself, and without architects doing the work, it doesn't work well. I'm saying that because you guys are predominantly architects and designers in this presentation. So the self-storage facilities have to have, this is not for individual closets or even for the bookcase I'm showing here. This is talking about a facility where people come in and store their stuff because they have more stuff they can fit in their house, or because they're moving, or for whatever reason it might be. We go to 1108.3, and based on the number of storage facilities provided, we determine the number of accessible facilities that have to be there. This is the one that's a nightmare. We disperse them among classes. Well, how do you classify self-storage facilities? Typically, the best way to do it is, I mean, there's simply heated and unheated, exterior access, interior access. I don't know. Heated and unheated is a clear one. Normally, it's going to be cost. You're going to look at cost ranges and say, hey, look, I'm offering, and the idea is to offer equal services. If I can go rent a 500 square foot storage facility, but if I'm disabled and the only one that's available to me is the 2,000 square foot storage facility, that's not fair. And so it has to be dispersed among classes. That doesn't mean that each classification has to have one. It just means I can't have more than one until I have at least one of each. You are allowed, in self-storage facilities, you often have multiple buildings throughout the space. Instead of having to try to provide an accessible route throughout the entire, complex, you're allowed to put all of the accessible features in a single building so that the accessible route is only needed to be provided to the one building. And so that's typically how I see that done in the field. Do you have to have accessible seating directly at a bar if you provide accessible seating near the bar? So the code says it has to be dispersed throughout, and so it's not extraordinarily clear, but the biggest issue I typically run into when it comes to bar seating versus main seating is that a bar is a fixed featured element, and the code says that 5% of all fixed seating must be accessible. Whereas 5% of your free seating is accessible, and those are counted separately. So it almost always forces the bar to have an accessible feature. Now, if you had other fixed seating that was accessible besides the bar, you could use that in lieu of the bar seating being accessible. So if I had fixed seating at the bar, and then I had fixed seating at a booth or something else in the area, I could disperse my 5% that way. But again, the code's going to say the second I need to have two, it's going to say, well, you have one at a booth, the other one should be located at the bar itself. So be careful about using that on your dispersion requirements. Courtrooms, they always have to have a wheelchair space for the jury box. So sorry, being disabled doesn't get you out of jury duty. For the gallery seating area, so that people can come in, and we're going to go to table 1108.2 for that. They're always required to have assistive listening devices, and the employee work area must be on accessible route. So this is an exception. Normally you can get out of it for an accessible route. So like the judge's stand is obviously an employee work area. It's less than 3,000 square feet. It's actually delineated and it's less than 1,000 square feet. And so it would normally meet the exceptions to get out of an accessible route. But the judge might be in a wheelchair, and so the code says the accessible route must always be provided for this building. Holding cells, central holding cells, one of each type has to be accessible. Where they're on a courtroom, one of each type has to be accessible, but you can have one that serves more than one court area. Visiting areas, this picture always disturbs me because I've got all these children pictures at a prison visiting area. And so that's kind of frightening, but at least 5% of them have to be accessible, and at least one has to be accessible on both sides so that you can have a disabled person, a person with a disability visit a person with a disability. Where there are partitions and glazing, at least one of those partitions has to be at the accessible height locations to view through. Okay, we are going to get a chance to get to toilet rooms, which is good because I postponed some questions and I hope I'm going to answer them now. What the code says is that each toilet room in a building has to be accessible, and at least one of each fixture provided in that toilet room has to be accessible. So here's a handy dandy accessible toilet that has a remote control. But on top of that, what that means is that there are some exceptions, but if I have a second floor of a building, like I said, there may be no accessible route, but every single bathroom, toilet room has to be accessible. If I have a live work unit and I decide to share the bathroom with the working space, I have in that bathroom a lavatory, a toilet, and a tub. Well, the tub might be just for the dwelling unit, just for the person that lives there, not for the employees and not for the public. But because it is a fixture in a bathroom that's accessible, the code says that all of them have to be accessible. So everything inside the accessible bathroom has to be made accessible. The exception, the first exception is private offices. And so this is a common. I have a bathroom on the second floor of a building. I have a private office on the second floor of a building. There's no accessible route up there, and it's going to be used only through the private office. I see this all the time in auto dealerships. And so the code says, well, the private office doesn't have to make the bathroom accessible. Now, I want to highlight that it's still a fully accessible bathroom. What the code says, if you look into the exceptions, is that you do not have to provide the grab bars. You just have to provide blocking for future grab bar installment. You're allowed to have a cabinet underneath the lavatory as long as it's removable, and the door can swing into a clear floor space as long as you can switch the swing of the door to make it accessible later. So it has to meet all the requirements for a fully accessible bathroom, even though it's only in a private office, even if it's only on the second floor of a building. Fully accessible, no exception. And then again, the exception is just because some of the features come down where you don't have to install the grab bars right away and you can have a cabinet underneath the sink. In individual dwelling units, we're not talking about those at all today. You'd go to 1107 and it all depends on what type of unit, type A, type B, type accessible, or for a lot of hotels, they may not even be required to have accessibility at all for most of their rooms. Now, the other question we asked was, do all toilets have to be accessible? Well, if I have a cluster of single user toilets, only 50% of each type must be accessible. So if I have a men's and a women's restroom and they're single user toilet rooms, 50% of the men's, 50% of the women's have to be accessible. So if I have just one-on-one, that's each of them have to be accessible. But if I have two unisex toilet rooms right next to each other, only one of them has to be fully accessible. The other unisex restroom does not need to be accessible. If the toilet room only has one urinal, that urinal is not required to be accessible. The accessible urinal is the second urinal. Toilet rooms in critical or intensive care sleeping units and high occupancies are not required to be accessible. Even though the room might be required to be accessible, the toilet room isn't, because they're going to use the toilet with assistance. Same for bariatrics patients. Primarily those used for children's use, children's toilets, don't have to be accessible. No, that's not what the exception says. They meet the accessible requirements for children's. A 17-inch tall toilet doesn't work for a child in a wheelchair. And so if you're dealing with an area that's like a daycare or an elementary school where you primarily have children using the toilet facility, you need to meet the children use accessible requirements. Privately funded apartment complex, what are the requirements for fully accessible units at accessible floors? So that's an interesting question. We're not really jumping into 1107 today, but just to answer that, I typically, as long as it's an R2 apartment complex, R2 being the use group, and it's permanent dwelling spaces, so intended as residences, it's not a timeshare facility. Type accessible units are not required for that facility. Only type A and type B for most apartment complexes. So you would not have any fully accessible units in a type an R2 apartment complex. All right, unisex toilet rooms. This is kind of a unique one, and this is the unisex or family assisted use toilet room. And these are required in A or M occupancies whenever I have an aggregate of more than at least 5 men or women's water closets required. Now, it's not 5 men's or 5 women's. It's more than 5 total required. And again, it's not provided, it's total required. So I go through the plumbing requirements in 29. I determine the number of fixtures. And the idea here is my mom was in a wheelchair. And so when I used to go places with her, if I'm going to an A or an M occupancy, that means I'm going shopping or I'm going to watch a movie. There's a high likelihood that I'm going to need to use the bathroom while I'm there. Well, I can't take my 60-plus-year-old mother into the men's restroom, and I'm not going to go into the women's restroom with her if she needs assistance to use the toilet. So what do? That's what the family and assisted use restroom is. And so it's saying that if I have at least 5 water closets combined, men's and women required, if I have more than 5 men's and women's water closets, then there's a likelihood that I'm going to have someone in the facility that needs assistance from someone of the opposite gender, and I must provide a family or assisted use restroom. Bathing facilities are slightly different. If I have a family assisted toilet room required, I'm in an A or an M occupancy and I have to have a family and assisted use toilet room. If I provide separate gender showers, now I also have to provide a bathing room. In all recreational facilities, regardless of the number of toilet facilities required, if I have a recreational facility, so a swimming pool, a gym, that requires a toilet, a bathing facility, that's providing me the bathing facility, I have to provide a family and assisted use bathing facility. So that if I were to take my mom in the wheelchair to the swimming pool, there would always be a shower that I could use to help her use the shower. There's always has to be one. So even if only one bathroom was required, that one bathroom would have to be a unisex family and assisted use restroom. So just be careful on that situation. The exception to that is if you only provide one bathing facility fixture in each. So as long as the men's restroom and the women's restroom only have one shower, you can get out of providing one inside the family and assisted use restroom. And it can be combined with a toilet, but the bathing facility must have a lavatory and one toilet, and then its location must be within 500 feet and one level of the separate gender toilet facilities. Water closet compartments. When we're looking at water closet compartments, we're going to say that wheelchair stalls, these are the ones here that have the larger stalls. 5% of all compartments must be wheelchair, so at least one always. Ambulatory stalls, if I have at least 6 toilet rooms or bathing toilets or urinals in a single room, one of them has to be an ambulatory stall. 5% of the remainder must be ambulatory. Lavatories, 5% of all lavatories have to be accessible. At least one must be located out of the stall. Once I have 6 or more, I have to have it use the enhanced reach range, which means I don't reach over the sink to get to the faucet. Those are for little kids to use or for little people. 5% of all sinks in the building, not including mop sinks or other work sinks for employee use only, those sinks are required to be accessible. Kitchens and kitchenettes are required to be accessible. That's your break rooms. Drinking fountains. I want to highlight this, and I'm going to say this, probably the most important thing I'm going to say today. The trick question is, you always have to have a minimum of 2 drinking fountains. Which one's accessible? And the trick question is, they both are accessible. The standing person drinking fountain and the drinking fountain for persons in wheelchairs are both accessible drinking fountains. So this is unique because the code requires that all drinking fountains, 100% of drinking fountains are accessible, but they're supposed to be split evenly between drinking fountains for standing persons and drinking fountains for persons in wheelchairs. The issue is that if you're me and you're over 6 feet tall, if you have arthritis, I don't, but if you were to have arthritis or other difficulties, you can't bend over to the 34-inch high wheelchair drinking fountain. And so you need to have the standing drinking fountain for that individual. So again, put the standing drinking fountain as high as possible whenever possible. Saunas and steam rooms, 5% must be accessible, must include a bench and a turnaround space. Storage, this is shelves and racks inside an individual building. Closets, 5%, but one of each type must be accessible. You must provide the same type of facility as non-accessible. So if I have a coat rack, I need an accessible coat rack. If I have a cabinet, I need a cabinet. If I have drawers, I need drawers. Seating at tables, 5% of all tables, and this is not fixed tables, this is free tables, must be accessible, and it must be dispersed throughout. You can't have all of them at the same table. Controls must be accessible. Fuel dispensers, and I just love this picture, and this one goes with a quote. Fuel dispensers are required to have accessible reach range, but the actual dispenser allows pinching and pinching, and that is permitted. Typically that's not permitted, but for a fuel dispenser, that pinching is allowed. Controls operable parts, just to highlight on that there are some that are not required. Dedicated outlets, floor outlets, HVAC diffusers, redundant controls, pool doors allow you to have higher outlets. Dressing rooms and lockers, 5% of each type, but 1 per cluster. Checkout aisles must be accessible. We're going to look at those as well. 1 per each type, and then they have to be dispersed. So again, if you have an express checkout, a self-checkout, and a regular checkout, it doesn't matter how many you have, but you have to have at least 1 of each. So even though you only had, if those were the only 3 you had, a self-checkout, an express, and a regular, that's 3 different checkout types. You come up here, the table 1 to 4, it says you only need 1, but you have to provide at least 1 of each. You have to disperse them again. You can't put all of the accessible at one end of the grocery store and that's it. Sales counters, we normally run into these POSs as they're labeled on the drawings in various locations. So a sales counter is only required to be accessible, 1 of each type, 1 per location. Location is normally the one that kills me because in department stores, they get scattered throughout, and so you normally end up having to make every single one accessible anyways. In food service lines, 50% of the self-service shelves have to be accessible. Then you don't have to provide all the food on that shelf. The trick is to put all the desserts on the accessible shelf so more people will buy them. And that's fine, only 50% of the self-service shelves have to be. But the entire queue and line coming into a building for a self-service food or for a food store has to be accessible. Watch out for these buildings like that have the queues coming in or the lines coming into them, such as the Costa Vitas, Cafe Rios, where they create this little line going through. You have to have the turning spaces and everything else inside those as well. So make sure we've got adequate width. Gaming tables and machines. This might happen, be more prevalent in Nevada than it is here in Utah. But if you have gaming machines, gaming tables, this is like a card table or something where you're going to play a game at that location. 2%, but at least one of each type is required to be accessible. So one roulette table, one poker table, etc., has to be made accessible. That accessibility must require a forward approach, neat toe clearance underneath. The next one we're going to look at is gaming machines. So that's like our slot machines here. 2% of the gaming machines have to be accessible, distributed throughout the type. So you can't just make it all the one type, but you don't have to have one of each. You just distribute it throughout. Again, a forward approach is all that's required. I'm going to stop at recreational facilities because we're out of time, but hopefully I've covered everything. Looking at the last question that came up from James, is a side approach acceptable for break area style sinks? There are some exceptions in ICC A117, and so as long as there is not a cooking surface, you are allowed to have a parallel approach for a sink and a kitchenette. So a break room sink, as long as there is no cooktop, you can have a side approach to that sink. So yes, there are some exceptions in there. All right, are there any other questions for me today on this presentation? All right, guys. Well, thank you very much for attending. And if you do have any questions, my contact information is on the last slide. Feel free to send me an email, or I'm sorry, my contact information is on the first slide on the front of the presentation. Feel free to send me an email or a call, and I'll see what I can do to answer the questions. But otherwise, I appreciate you having me out and for letting me present today.